Hey, how's it going? I'm going to answer a couple quick questions here. Do a short Periscope. So topics, securities, money, that kind of thing. I'll get right into it. James asks, have you ever wished you had a V8 after seeing someone drinking one? Sure. I love V8. It's pretty healthy. I hear it's high in sodium, though. Is it to be better to be loved or feared? I'll get to that one in a second. That's a good one. To what extent will tokenized assets be freely, widely traded as cryptocurrency? So I don't think they'll so much be traded as cryptocurrency. They won't necessarily be currency, although some will be currencies. But a lot of them are going to be securities or something else. So I think that the answer is they're going to be traded quite a bit. My thought is that this whole space is going to move towards securities, and I think that's exciting. There's not a lot of things other than securities that really have value, okay? So this kind of concept about, let's have utility tokens to avoid securities laws, it's got two problems. One, it's not a great method of trying to avoid the laws, and it may not work. But maybe more importantly than that, it's really hard to have economic terms around something that is not a security, because you can't share the revenue. If I have anything from a real estate deal to a restaurant to a nightclub or a tech startup or a biotech company, anytime you want to invest in that, we're going to want to have some kind of terms that can say, hey, here's what you're giving me, here's what I give you. You can't really do that with utility, the token, because all of the good things that would give you good terms would subject to that being a security. So I just say, you're better off being a security. I don't think there's going to be a lot of things other than securities. There's going to be a few cryptocurrencies, and then there's going to be, I shouldn't say that. There may be quite a few non-cryptocurrencies, game tokens and things like that. But as far as the type of stuff that you see trading on, say, CoinMarketCap, trading on exchanges for tens and tens of millions of dollars, I think most of those are either going to be a few real cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, and a couple others maybe, and a few real utility tokens that do real utility, major protocols or something like that, and then pockets of different sort of things like, rewards cards or game tokens or whatever, and then a whole bunch of securities tokens, hopefully thousands. I'd love to see a world where we have thousands of these things trading. Brian asks, what does freedom of the press really mean? A printing press, what is the difference between printing newspaper, fiat, stock paper, and creating digital tokens? So I think you're getting at this with the question as, can you just have securities creation fall under free speech? And the answer is no, not in the United States. You really can't. There are the federal laws there. You could say, okay, this is speech, I'm just printing something, but the way that the laws have worked since they've been existent, for right or wrong, they don't really count it as speech when you go and say, just same as if you do a violation of FDA rules, if you say that a drug causes a cure or something and it doesn't. There's all kinds of regulations, FTC, FDA. I'm not super familiar with those. I am pretty familiar with the SEC. That's the one I'm governed by, but there's all kinds of regulations related to what you're allowed to say out there in the United States that isn't covered by free speech or freedom of the press. So that's the law in the United States of whether why you can't just call it free speech to do these sort of things. LM asks, what do you think about Veriblock? Launches on mainnet March 25th, secures altcoins by praying to proof of work transactions. Veriblock's really cool, really interesting. I know the folks who work on that project, and I hear good things about it. I'm not, the type of person to do a super deep technical dive. Typically what I do in evaluating these kind of things, I listen to the company if I'm interested, and I am interested in Veriblock. 99% of the things out there I'm not interested in, but I am interested in Veriblock. So typically what I do in these kind of things, I have an analyst who takes a look at it. I will take a look at it in basic terms, and then I'll ask technical people that I think have good judgment on that particular kind of thing what they think. And Veriblock comes out pretty good in that analysis. The criticism I've heard is a little bit of centralization issues. But the concept is great, and I know it's a really smart team. I know it's interesting, so I'll certainly keep an eye on. I really like the idea of linking things to Bitcoin. I love Ravencoin, for example. The only real weakness of Ravencoin is that it is a much smaller chain. You could attack that chain much cheaper than you can with Bitcoin. But if you could link them somehow, that would be interesting. I don't think it's a fit for Ravencoin from what I hear from those developers, but I don't know. Maybe there's ways to do it. But the concept is great. Whether it's Raven or some other coin, that's great. This is two parts. How can small community-funded crypto projects attract developers, investors, and negotiate with exchanges who are asking a BTC for trade? So first part, how can a small community-funded crypto project attract developers and investors? Well, it's a trick. You've got to give them something they're interested in, and something that, most of the best developers are really interested in kind of solving problems and intellectual stimulation. So I'd say, look for things that can attract people from that, something that's unique, something that's different. The more sort of cypherpunk and roots with the roots that you have that are in line with the values of crypto, the better that might serve a community-funded project. The other thing is appoint leaders, I'd say. People love being leaders. Everybody loves to have their own thing. So if you can appoint somebody to run something, that's a lot better way to ask for help. Once it becomes their responsibility, people tend to kind of care. And that's the way most nonprofits and most community-funded everything, way before crypto, tends to work. You get sort of captains who work on this. And if a project is community-funded, most of the good exchanges should list it for free. Most of the good exchanges do that. For open source projects that I know of that don't, that have it, it's usually listed for free. Ravencoin, for example, Bitcoin, Litecoin, those are older, or Litecoin and Bitcoin are older. But there's exchanges that'll do it. Daniel Winter asks, what's the argument between John Rawls and Robert Nozick, who wrote Anarchy, State, and Utopia as underlying tension to contributing to current hyperpartisanship ignored? Leftists believe life is a lottery and playing fields should be leveled. The rest of the world is anti-big government. All right, so John Rawls wrote, I thought it was pretty interesting. One of the things he's famous for is this sort of veil of ignorance. It says if you're going to design a society, design it with this veil of ignorance. You don't know how you're going to come out. You don't know if you're going to be rich or poor, this group or that group, and design the most fair thing. So that's pretty interesting, and there's some other stuff around his philosophy that goes with that. Robert Nozick was more of an anarchist who wanted a much more smaller state and sort of wrote rebuttal to this sort of theory of justice that Rawls had. Rawls is, a lot of the ideas were really good and interesting, but they do have a definitely, like many good ideas, have kind of a statist-leaning sort of philosophy that sometimes harms those ideas. And in his case, it definitely was statist-leaning, and a lot of people took his work to say, hey, we need this system of fairness, so let's go for fairness of outcome rather than fairness of opportunity. And that's a real problem. And yes, it is true. There's a lot of leftists and a lot of statists who just don't really understand how the world works. And that's very dangerous because you have these people like like AOC, who's just has just such a fundamental lack of understanding about how the world works that it's downright dangerous. When she says such ridiculous things and she has the power of the state behind us, it's like a child waving a gun. It's literally like a toddler waving a desert eagle at you, pointing it around. She's extremely dangerous and has a lot of power because she's got this massive state that's been built up through, Trump and Obama and Clinton and Bush and the other Bush and so on, just this huge, massive state. And it's very interesting that people, a lot of liberals and a lot of fans of AOC, they're the same ones saying, look at this horrible thing that the government did, and look at these cops beating these people, and look at all these people in jail, and look at this and this and this. And they see the solution as more government, which is really strange because the solution is less government. Most of the evil that's being done is a result of the government. And a lot of the problems that we have is a result of the problems caused by government. So this idea that you can just make it fairer by tinkering with the system and using force, because that's all government is force. So, for example, AOC the other day had this really ridiculous comment that said, she was asking Wells Fargo, she said, if they loan money to a pipeline and the pipeline goes bad, shouldn't they be liable? That just shows a fundamental, complete and total lack of understanding of how the world works. It's not a question of, do we have them do bad things and we fine them, or do we have them do bad things and we don't fine them? For one thing, they're not doing the bad things, it's their lender. For another thing, that's a false choice that only somebody who has a childlike understanding of the world would think. They, only a child or somebody with a childlike understanding, like AOC, would think that, oh, if we just fine Wells Fargo because their lender does something, we'll solve everything. No, you won't solve everything. You would just simply and 100% certainly destroy all lending. No bank would lend under that circumstance. You do the math on it. And AOC's strong suit is not math. But if she did do the math, she'd say, okay, well, a bank lends $100 million for a building or a restaurant chain or a biotech company or a pipeline. They're only making $7 million or whatever on the interest every year. So presumably, anything that costs $100 million can cause a lot more than $100 million in damage. You build me a $100 million pipeline or factory, it could easily cause $1 billion in damage. But even if it's just the amount that it was, no bank would lend that. No bank would lend that. They just won't do it. They don't lend you money for a house. They have insurance on the house. They don't lend you money on a house with the chance that the house could go down to zero. Or that they have to pay back all of the value of that. It's just completely fundamental nonsense. It's completely ridiculous. And those kind of things, this is what happens. We see that complete and total fools can get into power. Children with guns. You're giving a toddler a machine gun. And that's what AOC is. She is a toddler with a machine gun, a completely and totally ignorant person who has no understanding about how the world works, and she's waving this gun around. She's got this huge, massive state with 300,000 people in the Department of Homeland Security and more people in prison than the Soviets had in gulags, more people in jail for non-violent drug offenses than any other country on the world. This massive, huge, violent, very, very violent, very, very destructive state. And you put somebody in charge of it who doesn't know how the world works. Oh, sure, let's pass this law, that law. And what happens with those things, you pass these laws, there are consequences. When you understand how the world works and how things like math works, and you do basic understanding, like talking to a bank and saying, how would this impact your business? And you would realize very, 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 very quickly that some flippant comment like that, if it became law, would completely and totally destroy the system. And that's what's happened in Venezuela. If you wonder, well, why are people, eating dogs? Well, it's because of people like AOC who just didn't know how the world works. And they say, oh, it's great. This will be great. Bernie Sanders with the, there's too many deodorants and you got to do this with Uber. Let's run Amazon out of town. These are profoundly dangerous, profoundly ignorant statements that are very, very, very dangerous. And the reason that they're dangerous is because they're backed by violence. So, AOC is not a charming dimwit who we can laugh at. She has the power of the state, which is the world's biggest gun. Don't worry, people, it's really weird that people are worried about let's make sure that the guy in New Hampshire who has a farm like me can't have a gun. Let's take the guns away from the people, but you give the biggest guns in the world to completely ignorant people who have a lot of power, who recklessly and with complete lack of understanding go out and willy-nilly go and create all these laws. And all of those laws, like everything else the state does, is backed by violence. It's backed by violence, and that's all the state can do. It's not a suggestion when AOC says to do something. It is backed by the state, and the state has only one thing that differentiates it from a nonprofit organization or any other organization, and that's its ability to crack heads, its ability to do violence. So it is profoundly violent. Please don't be fooled by High Septim from Game of Thrones or his twin Bernie Sanders, and don't be fooled by the charm and the meme ability of AOC. It is profoundly, profoundly dangerous, and if they had their way, people would die. Absolutely no question about it. If you put AOC or Bernie, even in the position of president, which isn't that much power in the United States because they do have check and balances, even if you put them in that position, I believe it would cause people to die. And there's a lot of evidence to that. Sounds bold and crazy, but look at Venezuela. Look at where their policies have actually been implemented. And think about the consequences of what they act. So that's my thought on that. How can we learn money, economics, and finance from scratch? What would be my advice to youth? So with my own kids, I try and have them learn budgeting and learn about running a business. Running a business is really, really, really key. You got to have products, and you got to have customers, and you got to solve a need. And so having some kind of small business as a young person, whether that's a child or however old you are, probably older than my kids if you're writing this on Twitter, but learning that kind of thing, getting out there, and it could be just a tiny business. You could just sell water after a game, water bottles. That's a business. You may only have the business open for one day, but it's still a business, and you can learn a lot from that because it gets you thinking in a mindset of, when does it make sense to, expand and how much are you making on what you spend? I'm very conscious of what things cost. Just yesterday we were talking about some tech support issues, and I said, wait a minute, that thing that's not going to make us any money is going to cost about $150 of employee time. So I said, I readjusted it on the conference call. I said, all right, well, let's just skip that thing. And the reason I have that is because as a very small business just starting out, I really cared. If I had somebody that was paying $16 an hour, I cared about that. If 2 hours, I say, well, boy, I better make $30 back. And that's very healthy. Small businesses, and some businesses are even better for this, like grocers, things where you got to constantly move product. Some of those things can help you a lot. And then doing, online stuff, doing online businesses, and learning, a bigger picture. As far as other things, I say focus on free markets economics, learn about stocks for sure. I think everybody from childhood on should learn what a stock is, how it works. For economics, it's more human interest and politics when you get into the big picture economic stuff, but that's kind of interesting as well. Would I support efforts, Nathan asked, would I support efforts to abolish financial segregation such as accredited investor status requirements? Absolutely. I think accredited investor doesn't make sense much. People should be able to make their own mistakes. The theory is, well, if you only let rich people into these special investments, they're better at deciding it, and they won't lose as much money, whatever. Poor people should have the right to invest as well. Everybody should have a right to invest. And the only way they're going to learn is doing the same mistakes that rich people. By the way, rich people almost always, unless they inherit the money, rich people always tend to make mistakes. That's how they got rich. You usually make mistakes on the way up. And if you rob people of that ability to make the mistakes and learn, that's bad. And people say, well, what if there's a bunch of predatory marketing? Well, there already is. And there already is on things that are available to unaccredited investors. You're not going to, again, going back to the regulation, you're not going to regulate away good behavior. All of these regulations don't tend to do that much. Bernie Madoff was head of a regulator. So if that gives you any idea of how effective regulation is, he should be the poster child for regulation. Because even if the head of the regulator is still a crook, that means that pretty much to me, all of the regulations are not going to cause that. What will stop it is, or at least reduce it, is better education, which is what I'm trying to do right now, and having more people understand these kind of things and think about it. So this other question was, is it better to be loved or feared? I don't know. That's a good question. I think there's benefits and drawbacks of both. Being feared makes it so people might be less likely to mess with you. And history is littered with a lot of people who were trying to be nice, whether it's entire cultures that are no longer existent. Everybody was killed because they tried to be nice and they weren't feared. And there's, I'm sure, many people as well who lost everything or just footnotes in history, never did anything because they were trying to be nice. You can also be a real jerk if you're feared. And to instill fear takes a lot of a little bit of your soul and a little bit, for some people anyway, a little bit of your soul and a little bit of your own energy. And it's hard to focus on that. So I think about this from time to time. I got, somebody robbed me and by just radically overcharging with fraudulent bills. And I've thought a lot about it. Do I be feared? Do I try and crush them so bad that I make an example of them that nobody will ever do it again? Do I just let the lawyers handle it, get the money back? Those are decisions that you have to make on a case-by-case basis. Overall, I think it's better to have people like you, but sometimes you have to defend yourself as well. So that's what we covered. A couple different things. I'll do more of these. I want to do some more on wealth, especially. But so we covered freedom of speech, the press, a little bit about securities and financial planning and stuff like that. Hopefully this is useful. I'll do more of these. Feel free to send some questions. I can try and get them on another video, or I'll do more of these. Thanks.